Welcome to AI, the Artificial Incontinence, where we perform dramatic readings of AI written slop. Today we've done something a little bit backwards from usual. Usually I start with the story and then have it design the art around it. Today I've started with the pictures and I'm having ChatGPT write a story around that. And so we have a short story about the inventor of the Honkulator who travels through time. And so we have the Honkulator, or a brief and thoroughly unnecessary triumph over time. The Honkulator was not, strictly speaking, meant to honk. It was meant to transcend. At least, that's what Professor Edwin Thistlewick insisted, loudly, repeatedly, and with the kind of conviction usually reserved for people who have either discovered something extraordinary or forgotten to tighten an important valve. The year was 1887, though the workshop itself looked as though it had been assembled from every year at once. From every year at once? So does that mean it has something from all eras? It had brass pipes spiraled like ambitious vines. Gauges blinked with quiet anxiety. And in the center stood the machine. A tall, polished, and faintly ridiculous machine. A placard on its front read, in elegant script, "The Honkulator." "Observe!" cried the professor, his beard bristling with excitement and possibly static electricity. "A device capable of bending time, space, and, if necessary, dignity." He grasped the lever. The machine hummed. Tubes glowed. Something deep inside it made a noise that sounded suspiciously like a goose clearing its throat. "Honk," it said. The professor froze. He said. "That's new." He adjusted a dial labeled chronospatial integrity, brackets, approximate, close brackets. The machine vibrated more intensely. Lights flickered. The air itself seemed to wrinkle. "Honk," it said again, louder this time, as if gaining confidence. "Right," said the professor. "We'll circle back to that." And then, with a decisive flourish, he pulled the lever. Time did not so much break as politely step aside. It's a very interesting personification of the concept of time. I don't know how time just steps aside. Steps aside of what? Space? I can't even think of another analogy there. We're going to keep going. The workshop vanished. The humming became wind. The glow became sunlight. Warmer, older, and carrying the faint scent of oil paint and ambition. There's those triplets again, thanks ChatGPT. Professor Thistlewick blinked. He stood now in a Renaissance studio, where canvases leaned like conspirators and half-finished sculptures contemplated their own incompletion. A man in paint-splattered robes turned, brush in hand, and stared. The professor beamed. "Good day. I appear to have arrived slightly early." The artist, who had been in the middle of inventing perspective, squinted at the Honkulator. "What," he asked slowly, "is that?" "This," said the professor, patting the brass contraption. "This is the future." The machine hummed. "Honk." The artist dropped his brush. They spent the afternoon together. Who, the artist and the professor, or the Honkulator and the professor? Maybe we'll keep going. The professor attempted to explain time travel using metaphors involving sandwiches and regret. Sandwiches and regret. I can relate to that. The artist, in turn, tried to sketch the machine, but kept getting distracted by its tubing, which refused to remain in the same orientation for more than a few seconds. At one point, the Honkulator emitted a particularly proud honk that echoed through the studio and out into the street. A small crowd gathered. "Is it a musical instrument?" someone asked. "A philosophical statement?" asked another. The professor hesitated. "It is," he said finally. "A work in progress." The artist nodded thoughtfully. "Aren't we all?" For a moment, the professor forgot about levers and timelines. He watched as the artist returned to his canvas, now attempting to capture not the machine, but the idea of it. The impossible geometry, the joyful absurdity, the way it made people stop and wonder. The Honkulator, perhaps sensing the shift, gave a softer honk, almost contemplative. The professor cleared his throat. "Well, onward, I suppose." And he pulled the lever again. The future arrived all at once. It was taller than expected. Okay. The buildings shimmered like thoughts mid-formation. The sky was a soft, programmable blue. People, if they were people, moved with ease that suggested they had solved most of their problems and were now working on, the interesting ones. The Honkulator landed with a dignified clank. "Honk," it said politely, on again. A small hovering device drifted over, scanning the professor from boots to bewilderment, whatever that means. "Welcome," it chimed. "You appear to be delightfully obsolete." "Thank you," said the professor, unsure whether to bow or not. A group of future dwellers approached, their expressions curious rather than alarmed. "What is it?" one asked, gesturing to the Honkulator. The professor straightened. "It's a machine that travels through time." They nodded. "And honks," he added. They paused. "That part," said another, "is new." "Yeah, the honking, that's different." The professor spent what might have been hours or days explaining his invention. Hours or days, they couldn't tell how long he's been talking. The future people listened with the kind of attention that suggested they had long since stopped dismissing strange ideas. That's a clunky sentence. Finally, one of them said, "We have devices that transverse time. We have devices that create art, simulate realities, and compose symphonies from the sound of starlight." The sound of starlight. That sounds like a great title for a story. Maybe that should be my next story. Tell it to create a story called The Sound of Starlight. The professor's shoulders sagged just a little. "But," the future person continued, "we do not have a machine that honks like that." As if on cue, the Honkulator produced its most magnificent honk yet. Rich, resonant, and oddly heartfelt. The future people smiled. "It reminds us," one said, "that not everything needs to be optimized." Another added, "or explained." The professor looked at his machine, at the pipes that made no sense, the gauges that lied with confidence, and the honk that refused to justify itself. He laughed. "I set out to conquer time," he said, "and instead, I built this." The Honkulator hummed. "Honk," it agreed. When the professor returned to his workshop in 1887, nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. The light through the window was the same. The tools lay where he'd left them. The world, stubbornly, continued. He placed a hand on the Honkulator. "Well," he said, "we've been about." The machine said nothing for a moment. Then, gently, "Honk." The professor nodded. He no longer felt the need to fix it. Wait, was it broken? Did I miss something? After all, it had taken him to the past, where people were still discovering how to see. Oh, I didn't realize I forgot they invented sight during the Renaissance. I forgot no one could see before then. Man, Italy, 500 years ago, man, when they invented vision, really, really blew everyone's mind. It had taken him to the future, where people had learned to appreciate what couldn't be improved. And in between, it had made a sound that served no purpose whatsoever, and yet had followed him through every moment. He picked up his wrench, then paused. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "transcendence isn't about escaping time." The Honkulator waited. "Perhaps," he continued, "it's about noticing it as it passes." The machine considered this, and then with impeccable timing, honk. And for once, that was exactly enough. All right, well, for our second part of this trilogy, I've decided, based on the images that I have, that it's time for Professor Thistlewick to become the ruler of the Soviet Union. I think that's the natural progression of this story. And so we have Honk for the Motherland, a completely reasonable continuation of these events. History, as it turns out, is remarkably tolerant of nonsense, provided it arrives with confidence. That is a true statement based on current day politics. For anyone listening in the future, for as long as this is out on the interwebs, it is the year 2026, and everything is stupid, but it's confident. That's the best way I can summarize the past few years. Anyway, going back along that thought, it's the year 2026 right now as I record this. If you're listening to this in the future, in the far future, what are you doing with your life? Seriously, you're listening to who knows how old recording of a dude sitting in his basement by himself reading from a chatbot about a thing called the Honkulator. You should probably be doing something else with your time. But in case you have nothing better to do, Professor Edwin Thistlewick, having previously decided not to fix the Honkulator, a decision widely regarded by the Honkulator as its finest feature, stood once more in his workshop in 1887, contemplating the future, the past, and the alarming tendency of his machine to develop personality. He said. "Honk," replied the Honkulator, helpfully. "Yes," the professor said. "That." He adjusted a dial labeled geopolitical consequences, brackets, tentative, close brackets, a dial he did not remember installing. But he pulled the lever. Time did not protest. He had, by now, accepted that the Honkulator would do as it pleased. The workshop dissolved into cold. Not a metaphorical cold, but the kind that suggests history is about to become very serious, and then it immediately fails to do so. Snow drifted across a wide square, buildings loomed with ideological enthusiasm, a banner flapped in the wind. The professor blinked. "Ah," he said. "Russia." A group of uniformed officials approached, their expressions stern in the way of men who have not yet encountered a brass machine that honks with conviction. "What is this?" demanded one. The professor straightened. "This is the Honkulator." "Honk," said the Honkulator. The officials froze. Well, yeah, it's Russia. The professor, sensing an opportunity, though not entirely certain what the opportunity was, raised a finger. Well, which finger, dude? "Honk for the motherland," he declared. The Honkulator, delighted to be included, obliged. "Honk!" The sound echoed across the square. Snow shifted. A pigeon reconsidered its life choices. The officials looked at one another. "Honk for the motherland," the professor repeated with greater enthusiasm. "Honk," said the Honkulator, now fully committed. A crowd began to gather. "Honk for the motherland," said someone tentatively. "Honk," replied the machine, and then, as these things sometimes do, it escalated. "Honk for the motherland, honk. Honk for the motherland, honk. Honk for the motherland, honk." The phrase took a rhythm, a purpose, a kind of entirely unearned legitimacy. Within the hour, it was being shouted from balconies. Within the day, it was painted on banners. Within the week, it was policy. The professor did not intend to become the ruler of the USSR. He simply found himself, one morning, seated at a large desk, while important people waited for him to say something that would define the direction of a nation. The old honk until you take over a global superpower trick. Man, it's just history repeating itself over and over again. He cleared his throat. Honk for the motherland, he said experimentally. Honk, said the Honkulator, which had been given a position of honor beside the desk. The officials nodded gravely. Excellent, one said. A strong stance. The professor blinked. Is it? It is, said another. Clear, direct, resonant. Honk, added the Honkulator, for emphasis. Policies were drafted, meetings were held. At every turn, the professor would offer the same guidance. Honk for the motherland. Honk. And somehow, through a combination of confusion, enthusiasm, and the undeniable charisma of a machine that honked with purpose, the nation functioned. Trains ran, factories produced. People, occasionally, paused mid-task to declare, honk for the motherland, and receive in return the comforting, unifying honk of agreement. It was the most conventional form of governance, but it was undeniably memorable. One evening, as snow fell with theatrical commitment, the professor stood alone with the Honkulator. I'm not entirely sure I'm qualified for this, he admitted. Honk, said the machine gently. Yes, said the professor. That's rather what I was afraid of. He looked out at the city, at the lights, at the people who had, for reasons both mysterious and entirely avoidable, placed their faith in a man with a time machine that refused to behave. Honk for the motherland, he said, softly. Honk, replied the Honkulator, quieter now, almost thoughtful. The professor sighed. Right, he said. It's time to go. The lever was pulled, and history, once again, stepped aside. Oh, it's history that steps aside this time, because last time it was time itself that stepped aside. The 1950s arrived in color. Not the hesitant color of reality, but the bold, enthusiastic color of cinema. Cars gleamed, signs glowed, everything appeared slightly more important than it actually was. The professor stood on a soundstage. Lights, cameras, a director with a megaphone, and a deeply personal relationship with urgency. Places, the director shouted. We're losing the light we created artificially. If that's not an analogy for, I don't know, the corporate line of just speeding up for the sake of speeding up. The professor blinked. Ah, he said. Film. How does the professor from 1887 know what film is? How does he know that? Was film invented? No. Film was not invented before 1887. No. The Honkulator hummed. Honk, it said appreciatively. I like how it always says the Honkulator hummed. It doesn't say it honked. It just says honk, but it's humming. The professor, having learned very little, but feeling very confident, approached the director. I have a story, he announced. The director did not hesitate. Does it involve drama? Intrigue? A machine? Yes. Does it honk? The professor paused. Yes, he said. The director's eyes lit up. We're greenlit. The film was titled Honk for the Motherland. Oh God, here we go again. It was, by most accounts, a triumph of enthusiasm over coherence. Scenes were recreated loosely. The snow was made of paper, The officials were played by actors who took the phrase "honk for the motherland" with a sincerity that bordered on alarming. But the USSR soldiers doing it was not alarming. Just the actors. I see where you're going with this, ChatGPT. I'm on to you, buddy. The professor insisted on authenticity. "Honk for the motherland," he would shout from behind the camera. "Honk," replied the Honkulator, now considered part of the cast. Take after take. "Honk for the motherland. Honk. Honk for the motherland. Honk. Honk for the motherland. Honk." The phrase echoed through the studio, through the script, through the very structure of film itself. Jesus. A little bit hyperbolic there. Until it became less of a line of dialogue and more of a fundamental law of the universe. Darn. The director wept openly. "This," he said, "is art." At the premiere, the audience sat in stunned silence. On screen, a slightly more handsome version of the professor declared, "Honk for the motherland." "Honk," responded a dramatically lit Honkulator. The audience shifted. Then, from somewhere in the back, "Honk for the motherland," someone whispered. "Honk," came the reply, from the film, from memory, from something larger than either. Laughter followed, then applause, then inexplicably, "Honk for the motherland! Honk!" The theater filled with it, a chorus, a joke, a shared moment that made no sense and yet required none. Later, as the lights dimmed and the world returned to something resembling normal, the professor stood beside the Honkulator. "Well," he said, "we've done it again." "Honk," said the machine. "We ruled a nation." "Honk." "We made a film." "Honk." The professor considered this. "I'm beginning to suspect," he said, "that the purpose of all this is not to control time, nor history, nor even the narrative." The Honkulator waited. "Honk for the motherland," the professor said one last time. The machine responded, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with a quiet, perfect certainty. "Honk." And somewhere, across the years, across the places, and across the entirely avoidable decisions, the echo answered, "Honk for the motherland." Okay, I'm just popping in here with an edit from Luma AI, which is what I use to create these images. And it asked me if I wanted to make a story or an image about the Honkulator in a Soviet propaganda style. And I said, "Soviet propaganda, make the Honkulator text look like Cyrillic letters." And its reply said, "Comrade, the Honkulator belongs to the people." And for our conclusion, we have a more perfect honk. History, having already made several concessions to absurdity, decided, briefly, to aim for something like hope. Professor Edwin Thistlewick stood once more beside the Honkulator, though by now it stood beside him in a way that suggested partnership rather than accident. They had crossed centuries, ruled nations, inadvisably, and premiered films, questionably. And yet, here they were again, on the edge of something new. "America," said the professor, consulting a map that had politely given up being accurate. What does that mean? "This should be interesting." "Honk," said the Honkulator. With what might have been anticipation, the lever was pulled. The air changed. It was colder. No, warmer. But louder. Alive with the hum of voices, the shuffle of ambition, the steady, persistent rhythm of people attempting to agree with one another and occasionally succeeding. Washington, D.C. had unfolded around them. The professor adjusted his coat, something between statesman and slightly overconfident clockmaker, and stepped forward, the Honkulator rolling beside him with dignified clatter. "What is that?" someone asked. "This," said the professor without hesitation, "is the future." "Honk," said the Honkulator. There was a pause. And then, because history had learned nothing if not consistency, someone said, "Well, it sounds confident." Campaigns, it turns out, are not so different from time travel. All right, I'm curious where this is going. Both require a certain disregard for logic. Okay, fair enough. A tolerance for unpredictability. And the ability to stand in front of a crowd and declare something that feels true, even if it cannot yet be proven. The professor spoke often. Not about conquest, not about control, not even about honking, though that inevitably came up, but about what he had seen. "I visited the past," he said, to a gathering of curious listeners, where people were learning how to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. "Honk," said the Honkulator from stage left. "I have seen the future," he continued, "where people have solved so much that they are finally free to appreciate what cannot be solved." "Honk." "And in between," he said, smiling, "I have learned that progress is not always a straight line. Sometimes it's a very strange machine making a very unnecessary noise." The crowd laughed. The Honkulator, sensing its cue, offered a particularly well-timed honk. The election was, by all accounts, usual. Debates were held, policies were discussed. At one point, a moderator asked the professor to clarify his stance on infrastructure. He considered this carefully. "I believe," he said, "in building things that connect us, not just physically, but meaningfully. Roads, bridges, ideas, and occasionally, machines that remind us not to take ourselves too seriously." "Honk," said the Honkulator. The moderator blinked. "Thank you," they said. Honestly, I'd vote for him. On a bright morning that felt suspiciously like a beginning, Professor Edwin Thistlewick placed his hand on a book that had witnessed more history than it cared to comment on. "I do solemnly swear," he began. The Honkulator stood nearby, polished to an almost ceremonial shine. "And affirm," he continued, "that I will do my best, not to perfect this country, but to guide it, not to control time, but to respect it, and not to silence the absurd, but to learn from it." There was a pause. He glanced, briefly, at the Honkulator. "And," he added, "to listen." "Honk," said the machine. The crowd smiled. "I don't have the presidential oath of office committed to memory, but I don't think it's, 'I do solemnly swear and affirm that I will do my best, not to perfect this country, but to guide it, not to control time, but to respect it, and not to silence the absurd, but to learn from it, and to listen.' Honk. I don't think that's the actual oath of office, but what do I know? I'm not a politician." The presidency, like time travel, proved to be less about grand gestures and more about small, consistent decisions. There were meetings, there were disagreements, there were moments when everything felt, in the professor's own words, a bit all honked up. Nice. And yet, he remembered the Renaissance artist who had tried to capture an impossible machine and had instead captured an idea. He remembered the future, where people had learned to value what could not be optimized. He even remembered the USSR, though he chose to remember it gently, where a single absurd phrase had, for a time, brought people together. So he governed accordingly. He encouraged innovation, but not at the cost of wonder. He supported progress, but not at the expense of connection. And every so often, when things grew too tense, too complicated, too certain of their own seriousness, he would lean back, glance at the Honkulator, and say, "Well?" And the machine, never missing its moment, would reply, "Honk." And somehow that helped. As the millennium approached, a line drawn not in sand, but in expectation, the professor stood before a crowd once more. "We are stepping into the future," he said, "not as masters of it, but as participants." The Honkulator hummed softly beside him. "We will make mistakes," he continued. "We will misunderstand one another. We will, at times, feel completely and utterly all honked up." The crowd laughed knowingly. "But," he said, "we will also create and learn and adapt. We will build things that last and things that don't, but matter anyway." He placed a hand on the Honkulator. "And if we're very lucky," he added, "we'll remember that not everything needs to be perfect to be meaningful." The machine considered this. Then, with impeccable timing, as it always had, honk. The sound carried, not as noise, but as something warmer, a reminder, a beginning. And for a brief, improbable moment, the past, the present, and the future seemed to agree. It was enough. The end. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of AI, the Artificial Incontinence. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the bell wherever it shows up. And have a lovely, lovely night.